The cabin lights flickered once, then died completely, plunging the screaming passengers into absolute darkness. An acrid, metallic scent, like hot ozone and old pennies, flooded the air, thick enough to taste. Outside the rain-streaked window, something impossible moved within the storm clouds. A vast, serpentine shadow that eclipsed the lightning. Then came the sound, not thunder, but a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the seats and into their bones. A passenger near the wing touched the cold, damp interior wall and recoiled. It was weeping a viscous, black fluid. From the cockpit, a new sound cut through the chaos. Not a pilot's voice, but a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The plane banked sharply, not from turbulence, but as if something massive had taken hold of it from the outside. In that final moment before impact, every soul aboard knew, with a certainty that hollowed them out, that they were not crashing. They were being taken, the world inverted with a sickening crunch of metal and bone. Chaotic, strobing cuts seared the moment into his mind. The ceiling was now the floor, the seatbelt, the fuel anchor. The metallic tang of blood mixed with the sharp, chemical stench of ruptured aviation fuel. Cold rain needled his skin through the torn fuselage. A brutal baptism into this new, shattered reality. He's gasping, utterly alone in the darkness. What if the only thing standing between you and a slow, agonizing death was your own shattered body? This is not a story of rescue. This is a story of survival so grotesque, so medically bizarre, that doctors would later call it impossible. This is the story of a man who, trapped in a wreck at the edge of the world, was forced to drink using his own broken skull as a filter. The backstory, narrated. His name was Leo Carter. From Austin, Texas, Leo was a structural engineer, a man who trusted logic, physics, and the integrity of things built by human hands. Golden hour light bathed the backyard as he taught his young son Jake the perfect baseball swing, all smiles and laughter. He was flying home from a consultant job in Seattle, a routine commuter flight, just a 2-hour hop. The cabin air grew thick with the metallic tang of ozone, like before a storm. Then came the first unnatural shudder through the fuselage, a deep mechanical groan that vibrated in their bones. Sarah and Jake waited anxiously, already picturing the promised pancake dinner. Leo sent one last cheerful text before boarding the twin propeller plane. The aircraft's interior smelled of stale coffee and damp upholstery. As the engine sputtered to life, a metallic tang settled in the air. Among the passengers sat Mike, a weary businessman, and Chloe, a college student lost in her headphones. They represented the last vestiges of Earth, but the sky had other, far darker designs. A storm system, more furious and swift than any forecast dared to predict, erupted over the remote, jagged peaks of the Rockies. Unknowingly, Flight 227 was barreling directly into its maw. It began with a violent jolt that rattled every bone in the cabin, the seatbelt sign pinging on with an unnerving finality. The air grew thick, a sharp scent of ozone and cold sweat, a metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. Outside the windows, the storm wasn't just weather. It was a living, churning darkness that seemed to press against the glass. Then came the sound, not thunder, but a deep, structural groan from the aircraft's frame. A sound that spoke of things bending that should never bend. Then it transformed into something else entirely. The plane became a mere leaf in a hurricane. Over the intercom, the pilot's voice crackled, strained, saying they were attempting to divert. From Leo's seat, the world dissolved into a shaky, chaotic point of view. The metallic scent of fear filled the pressurized air as the fuselage groaned under the strain. Drinks cascaded across laps as overhead bins rattled violently open. Chloe whispered frantic prayers, her voice interpreting red in chaos. Mike's knuckles blanched bone white where they gripped the armrests, tendons straining. Then, the unthinkable, a white-hot flash reached the cabin, followed by an explosive crack that rattled the teeth. The left engine sputtered and died, a metallic groan swallowed by the storm. The aircraft lurched violently, a gut-wrenching tilt that sent loose objects clattering down the aisle. We screamed toward the jagged, snow-dusted peaks below, the air thick with the scent of ozone and cold dread. The screech of tearing metal was the final, horrifying note of the catastrophe. It was followed by a colossal, world-ending thud that seemed to shake the very ground. Then came the silence, but not a true, empty silence. It was a thick, heavy quiet, broken only by the faint, wet drip of unseen moisture and the distant electrical hum of dying systems. The rain hissed against decaying metal, a rhythmic percussion to the wind's low moan. A sharp, metallic groan shuddered through the structure as consciousness returned to it. The air carried the damp, coppery scent of rust and something faintly organic, like wet earth. Every surface he touched was cold and slick, the world a blur of sound and sensation. He hung inverted, suspended by his seatbelt as the cabin became a tilted tomb. Through a massive gash in the fuselage, he saw pine trees swaying violently in the driving rain. The air smelled of ozone and wet earth, a metallic taste coating his tongue. Then he saw Mike, still buckled in his seat, neck bent at an impossible angle. Leo was alive, but imprisoned in a coffin of wreckage, thousands of feet up the mountain. freezing storm howled outside his metallic tomb. His leg was shattered, his ribs cracked, each shallow breath a stab of icy fire. The air reeked of crushed pine, cold iron, and the sharp, metallic tang of his own blood. A searing, blinding pain radiated from the side of his head. When his fingers touched the wound, they came away wet with blood and something gritty. Time dissolved into a thick haze of unrelenting agony. Driven by a raw instinct to survive, he tore a strip from the seat cushion and bound his wounded leg. His voice gave out, swallowed by the howling wind. The cold gnawed at his bones like a living predator. By the third day, a new torment arrived. A thirst that cracked his lips and seared his throat. It burned hotter than the wounds leaping down his side. A desperate, consuming fire within. The air tasted of iron and dust. A gritty reminder of the moisture his body craved but could not find. The storm had passed, leaving a dripping, cruel paradise. Rainwater pooled on the twisted metal above him, then streamed down in tempting rivulets, only to vanish into the muddy, oil-stained debris below. It was undrinkable, filthy with the acrid stench of jet fuel, the metallic tang of blood, and the promise of rot. To drink it was to invite a slow, internal poisoning. A primal dread took hold as the desperate thirst clawed at his throat. On the fourth day, a grotesque mercy arrived. Leo, his lips cracked and eyes hollow, tilted his head back, and the cold droplet struck his forehead. He felt an internal trickle, not water sliding down his skin, but a strange, viscous sensation moving within him. The air, thick with the scent of wet rot and ozone, seemed to grow heavier as the impossible sensation took root. A frigid sensation traced a path down his nasal cavity and into his parched throat. His hand rose slowly, trembling, toward the gritty, throbbing wound on his left temple. The impact hadn't just cracked his skull, it had created a complex, depressed fracture perilously close to the temporal bone. A primal dread took hold as the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth, confirming the terrible truth. The rainwater carved a tiny, unintended channel through his fractured skull. Each drop seeped through microscopic pathways in the bone, filtered by layers of dense tissue. It emerged transformed, sterilized by his own catastrophic biology. His survival mechanism was born from ruin. Leo wept with revulsion as he positioned his head under the steady drip. Each drop hit his scalp with a soft, wet sound that echoed in the cramped space. He swallowed the metallic water, every gulp tasting of copper and his own mortality. In that moment, he wasn't just drinking water. He was consuming the bitter reminder of his own broken fragility. He was keeping himself alive by performing a slow, continuous autopsy on himself. Each incision a grim negotiation for another breath. The distant thump-thump-thump of helicopter blades broke the mountain's oppressive stillness, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very wreckage. The air, thick with the metallic scent of his own blood, suddenly carried the faint, ozone-tinged promise of rescue. After 8 days of fighting a war against his own failing body, the battle was over. Search and rescue teams finally spotted the wreckage from a distant trail. When they reached Leo, he was delirious and severely dehydrated, yet somehow still alive. What baffled the rescuers wasn't just his survival, but the complete absence of infection. His system should have been ravaged by the contaminated water he'd been drinking for days. The sterile hospital room held them in a fragile bubble of relief. On a light board, the doctor's finger traced the complex fracture in Leo's skull skin. His voice was low, almost reverent, as he explained the impossible. The bone and duramater, they trapped the particulate. They inhibited the growth. Leo recovered physically. The leg healed, the skull was repaired. But some fractures don't show up on an x-ray. The air in his apartment grew heavy with the scent of ozone and stale rot. Every shadow seemed to whisper, and the cold dampness clung to his skin like a second layer. Leo stood motionless under the shower's spray, his body rigid. The water's touch on his scalp sent a jolt through his nerves. He flinched, his hand snapping to his temple as if struck. A faint, metallic scent of iron mixed with the steam, deepening his unease. He only drinks from sealed bottles. Leo Carter survived because his body fractured in the precise, terrible way that spared him. He was saved by the very mechanism that should have ended him. So tonight, as you raise a glass, remember Leo and ask yourself, what part of your own soul would you devour, just to glimpse another dawn? The wreckage lay before us, a rusting scar upon the mountain's face. An oppressive stillness settled over the site, broken only by the first drops of cold rain. The metallic tang of wet rust and damp earth filled the heavy air. Then the screen faded to black, leaving only the echo of that final, lonely image.